It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Father John Brown. Many of you know him as the president of our high school, but he himself is also an accomplished artist in his own right, creating some wonderful works of art, both casually and professionally. He's also the chaplain for the St. Louis IX Society, which is here in New Orleans, and exists for fraternity and creativity between local artists, especially local artists that produce religious art. So he's a man that knows art well and theology well, and he'll be sharing his thoughts on those two subjects tonight. Without further ado, I introduce Father John Brown.
Good evening. Father Paul said, I'm an accomplished artist in my own right. Those are big words. I made a holy card one time, and I also sold a painting of a duck for $10,000 at Jesuit's auction, which was pretty great. So those are my biggest accomplishments in art. But I am a lover of art, and I did grow up thinking that I was going to be an artist. I don't know why. Somebody somewhere along the way told me that I was good at that when I was like 5 years old, and I'm sure I was as bad as any other 5-year-old. But I thought if I was good at it, I should do it a lot, and I started just drawing every chance that I got. And my friends were always asking me to draw things for them, and next thing you knew, I thought I was going to make a career out of it. Right out of high school, I started working as a website developer, so doing the graphic design for websites and all that. And so I really have a passion for it and a love for it. That really, the only thing that got me out of it was to listen to God and become a Jesuit. So here I am. One of our great supporters of the high school wrote an email today to us at the school saying, thank you for the reminder to come to the talk. I'm sure I will learn a lot because I don't know anything about art. So the talk is not intended to be a big educational, thing that's going to turn you into a great connoisseur of modern art. That is definitely not what I want to do. But what I do want you to understand is what art is for according to the Catholic Church. What do we think art is for? So I don't think it's a big secret that we have sort of two problems that we deal with in these days, right, in these times. The first is your general population, most people do not really appreciate contemporary art. The art that is being created now by professional artists is not really for the people, for the masses, okay? That's one problem, if you want to call it a problem. The other is art has been for centuries now following certain philosophical paths that are hostile to religion. They do not, art and religion are not growing closer and closer together over time. If you just look at the general streams of art. And that's worth taking a look at, worth understanding. Art, for most people, if you ask them, what is art exactly, you're going to get a lot of different answers. For many people, they will tell you art is what is going to delight my senses, right? So if it's a beautiful picture, I'm going to, feel good by looking at it, right? I'm going to get some sort of sense of what it is, and it's going to make me feel good. And in a lot of ways, if art is in the eye of the beholder, that means that a lot of the art that is created, some of it is going to appeal to you and some of it's not, and it might be considered just a matter of taste. Another way of looking at art might also be the skill of the artist. So art is an art form, right? It's the skill of being able to do a thing with a paintbrush, right? And I think the thing that you are doing that makes it good art is your ability to integrate things like colors and texture and light and dark, and to integrate those with some other idea that is powerful, some powerful concept, right? Not just throwing a bunch of colors and lines together, but really pointing people's minds to something greater. Then we start to say, that is really good art when we see it. Sacred art, then, if you want to talk about sacred art or liturgical art, is art that doesn't just point you to a deeper truth, but points you to those truths that we associate with our faith, right? The deepest of all truths. Not just a vague sense of, power or envy or, lust or sadness, but something which points us towards a truth that our religion holds to be true, right? So sacred art, in the history of art, used to be that it informed the profane. Sacred art informed the kind of art that you might have outside of sacred spaces. So if you'd go to a big church, which is what everybody used to, they'd put their money into the church, and even poor villages would have the nicest building in a poor village would be the church, right? It would be the tallest building, the nicest building, and when you'd go inside, there would be great works of art inside that church. And then in the wealthiest people's homes, they would also sort of imitate that in some kind of way. So if you'd go to the king's home, for example, he might have in his home a picture of fox hunting or something like that on the wall, or in some tapestry, a knight riding a horse, that in some sense he would get his sense of style and beauty. It would be informed by what happens in the church, and then he would imitate that in his home in some kind of way. So churches were the best buildings in the city, and the artwork inside it influenced what happened in people's homes. The art style in the church was also very influential. So whatever the newest and latest and greatest churches had inside of them, people wanted to imitate in their own homes in some kind of way. And art, for centuries, considered style to be secondary to the substance. In fact, they would even sometimes restrain the style and hold back on the style so as to make sure that you didn't get distracted by it. Think of art from the first several centuries of Christianity, the icons, right? You've all seen the icons. They look kind of flat, right? The robes are almost never flowing all over the place, right? They're almost always pretty straight, and the folds in the robes are really, really these hard lines that kind of go at almost right angles everywhere. The faces of the people in those paintings are almost cartoonish, right? You've seen icons before, you know what I'm talking about. Or you've seen the artwork that comes from churches during the medieval period. This is not because they just didn't have good artists. This is not because there were just no Michelangelos, no Donatellos. They had people who could paint very realistically, but they chose not to. They chose to paint in a very restrained style so that you would see it and get from it something more important than the style. Very few people can name artists from the first 1,000 years of Christianity. Very few people can tell you who painted those famous icons from that period in the church's life. And then the Renaissance comes along. During the Renaissance, you found this new enjoyment of things which were earthly, this new enjoyment of things which were human, right? And so there were big influences from the ancients, from the Greeks. That's why they called it the Renaissance. It's the rebirth of a lot of what they believed was ancient wisdom. And they lost their fear of borrowing from those styles of the Greeks. So you've seen Greek art, right? These Roman statues and Greek statues that look more than realistic, right? It's these glorified bodies. Think of the statues that you would see of these ancient Greek gods. They had this power that was really very, very human looking, right? These big muscular statues of Zeus, right? Carrying thunderbolts with the big flowing beard. During the Renaissance period, Renaissance artists copied that. And they were not scared to do that. They were not scared to borrow images that look like Zeus and say, that's not Zeus, that's God. On the roof of the Sistine Chapel, I know everybody knows the image. On the roof of the Sistine Chapel, there's an image of God the Father coming down and putting out his finger and just touching the hand of Adam while Adam is kind of reclined back, waiting to just make some contact with this God. That God looks just like Zeus, right? And he's almost naked. And Adam is naked. There was no fear of the human body. There was no more fear of these other forms because we know who is the one triumphant God. We know who wins the battle between the ancient Greek gods and our one true God. So once we win, It's perfectly okay to absorb those cultures, absorb those things, and use them. So thought the people during the Renaissance. However, some new things begin to happen. Instead of restraining the art style, they just went all out, right? They made it just as beautiful and flowing and earthly as they possibly could. And they say that's what glory looks like. It's the earthly lifted up. Now remember, I said that the job of art is to take what is lowly and what is greater and above and truthful and somehow integrate them together, somehow pull them together. And during the Renaissance, they did that. And those who were best at it were remembered. We can name the artists from that period. We can name Leonardo da Vinci. We can name Michelangelo, right? We can name some of these great Renaissance artists. Van Eyck a little bit after that, and a little bit after that, El Greco. We start remembering the names of these artists because their own contribution begins to take center stage. Their own contribution, not so much the truth that they are pointing to, but their skill in pointing to that truth begins to seem more important. And you notice that the restraint where the clothes that the icons wear that look so flat and so basic turns into something much more flowing and going, right? This is not by accident, right? This is because the philosophy of those artists during that time had changed their beliefs from what these sort of Byzantine icon artists, painters believed in. They had changed their beliefs and had expanded what they were willing to do. And in fact, they are remembered for it. Also, if you think about those Byzantine icons or any of those icons that we now associate with the East, kind of Eastern or sometimes Orthodox icons, we tend to think of those Eastern images as almost always doing one of two things. Either it's showing you a scene that should make you recall, like the resurrection, right? Jesus is popping out of the tomb, and there's a big crack in the earth, and he's holding the hand of Adam, and he's pulling Adam up out of the earth, and all these saints are so excited and happy. And so you're seeing an image referring to theological truth of the resurrection, right? Or you might see just the picture of a saint who is looking at you. And maybe they're holding up in their fingers something that says, we have three persons and one God with two natures in one of the persons, or something like that. Some theological truth that is represented in these different symbols, and they're looking directly at you. And you're supposed to look back. You're supposed to see in those icons the face of a saint. And your devotion to that image is the best we can do in terms of a devotion for or towards that saint. So if you think about it, we see people kiss those icons, right? Go up and kiss those things. It's not unlike if you keep a picture in your wallet of somebody that you love, and once you haven't seen them for a really long time, you might pull out that picture in your wallet and look at the person you love, and maybe even once in a while you kiss that picture and you say, gosh, I really miss that person. That interaction is the same kind of interaction that those early icon painters expected you to have with their art. When it comes to the Renaissance and after that, it's different. It's almost like you're in the bushes peering into a scene that you get to be an observer of a thing that's happening. And by the way that the people are organized in the painting, it's almost as though you become an observer in the painting. You become a person taking part in the artwork itself. That's very different. It's going to give you a very different feel. So you start to see, for example, the backs of people's heads. Now, you cannot find, I challenge you to find a painting that's over 1,000 years old that shows the back of someone's head. It's not going to happen. But as soon as you get to Michelangelo and Leonardo and those guys, you begin to see as if you are peering into a scene. You're beginning to take part in the art, and you're just part of a real scene. And the more realistic the scene looks, the better we might say that art is, right? Okay, so fast forward a little bit more, and you get to more what we think of as modern art. And then it gets weird. Remember how I said that art, the job of art, is to take what is below and point you up towards something to integrate you with something that is above. right? Some greater idea, some greater concept. Modern art does this, but it does it at the social level. So, for example, have you ever seen, you might know that there was this artist, his name was Duchamp, and he took a urinal from a public bathroom and he put it in an art museum, right? He took what is the lowest of the low. A urinal is about as low as you can get, right? And he put it in an art museum, and all these fancy people with lots of money and everything show up and they're drinking their champagne and looking at this urinal and saying, oh, look at that. Isn't it wonderful? Like, isn't it new? Isn't it exciting? Doesn't it do what we like art to do? Doesn't it make us think? Doesn't it what does it make you think of? A urinal, right? What does it make you think of? He was also famous for taking a painting of the Mona Lisa and putting a mustache on her, right? And so, like, somehow graffiti became the comment, the social comment, as if to take what is the lowest art form, graffiti, and integrate it with the highest art form, the Mona Lisa, the world-renowned painting, one of the most famous paintings in the world. And he puts graffiti on the Mona Lisa. And everyone in the museum is sipping their champagne and saying, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this great? This is exciting. Your average people are not excited by this, right? You're like me, average people like me are not excited by this, except for one thing. It is funny. It is funny to think of fancy people staring at a urinal and calling it art. It does kind of sort of say, you know what, our world is upside down. That's kind of funny that this guy got away with it. It's kind of funny that today somebody could take a big piece of duct tape and duct tape a banana to a wall and say, there's my big piece of art. And everybody kind of looks at it and goes, oh, that's interesting, right? That's funny. Like, to me, that's a comedy routine. It's a comedy routine. So I'm sort of sad in some ways that maybe art has gotten off the rails a little bit. But I also see that what I said art was, which is bringing the below and taking what's up above, something greater, and pulling them together and integrating them together, it is happening. It's happening on someone's terms, right? If you look at modern art and you say, that's just stupid, a 5-year-old could do that. There aren't any 5-year-olds doing it. I think it's incredibly intelligent and incredibly talented. Talent not being used in the right sense, right? I'm not saying this is good, but I do see that there's a lot more there than you might think. The fact that somebody puts a urinal in a museum is not just a dumb thing. It's a crazy thing, but it's intelligent. It's being done by somebody who knows what they are doing, who understands what they are doing, and they are buying into a philosophy which is hostile to our faith, a philosophy which does not fit what we really and truly believe. So art, instead of bringing what is below up to what is above or pointing to what is above, it takes what is above and it sort of pulls it down. And it kind of makes it common. It makes it down below and brings it down to us, right? And so I think that takes a lot of talent and intelligence. So if you look back at the oldest art that we have, I mean, you have to go back to archaeologists, or historians can barely tell us anything about it. You have to go all the way back to archaeology now to understand some art that's so old. I'm talking about pre-Christian art, what that looked like. There was, for the pagan religions around surrounding the Jewish people, a sense that art was powerful in its religious context to the point of it being the way that you worshiped. If you were to go into a temple of a pagan god in, the Canaanite pagan gods, or those that worship Baal or Apis or whoever it was, you would go and you would find in those places a statue of often some what we would think of as an abomination, right? Some man with the head of a bull or something like that, right? And they would have this big opening of the mouth ceremony when they would dedicate this statue. Some artist would create this work, and then they would open the mouth of the statue somehow, and they would say that statue was, in a sense, going to breathe into itself the spirit of this pagan god, right? And so they then would worship the statue. They wouldn't just create any old thing and worship it, right? They would create it, and then they would have this whole ceremony that would, in a sense, get the pagan god to possess the statue. And they believed in that. They really believed in it. So the Jews, on the other hand, did something that was pretty amazing. They set up the seat of God, the place that they expect God to come, and they don't put a statue there. The pagans would often have like these two winged creatures that would point inwards, and in the middle of those two on this altar is where they would place their statue. The Jews have the Ark of the Covenant. You've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know what it looks like, right? It's this big kind of box-shaped thing, and it's covered in gold, and it's got these two angels. But instead of a statue, instead of an idol right there in the middle, it's empty. There's no physical thing there. There's no physical statue there for God to possess, right? So the Jews, in a sense, to the pagans, the Jews looked like atheists, because where's your idol? Where's your God? Where's your thing that's supposed to go there in the middle, right? This is why it was so bad that when Moses goes up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments from God, when he comes down and finds them worshiping this bull, right, this idol, this is why God gets so upset by this, because he said, I want to be the one to fill that space. I want to be the one to occupy the space on top of your altar. I want to come down and rest on your altar. Me, not some man-made object of art. I want to be the one. As Christians, we know exactly when that happens. That's Jesus, right? Jesus is God coming down to rest on our altar. That's the space we expect God to come down and rest. And so we don't create some idol to put there and expect God to possess it. We expect God to send the whole thing down on top of that altar for us, to come down and be the one there for us to worship. You see, God has a habit of breaking His own rules. I say this very carefully. I see a couple of guys in Jesuit uniforms. Don't believe what I'm saying. God never breaks the rules. But for those of us who are a little bit more mature, you might notice that sometimes we have in our mind these sacred rules that God has given us, and then if you think about it, He breaks those rules. He says, you cannot see me and live. And then He lets everyone see Him nailed to a cross, right? He says, don't make any graven images. And then He says, oh, by the way, make an image of a serpent and put it on a pole, and if you look upon it, you'll be saved. Whenever the Jews are all out in the desert and they're getting bit by these snakes and they're calling out to God, how can you save us? God says, make an image, a bronze image of a snake, hold it up high on a pole for everybody to see, and that's what's going to save them. That's like God breaking His own rules. He says, don't ever mix fabrics, right? Don't ever take don't ever take silk and cotton and weave them together. Don't ever do that. Except, He says, you should do it whenever you're making the robes of the priest who's going to serve in the temple, right? Except whenever you're going to make the coverings up above of the tabernacle that was moved around in the desert for everybody. It's like He makes a rule for us to follow so that He can be the one to come in and fulfill it or break it, so that He can be the one to come in and do it. This is how God seems to do things. In our own days, think about it, He says, do not name the sin, right? Do not miss Mass on Sundays. Do not lie. Do not steal. These are all things that will land you in a real hot place, right? And then He forgives us when we do it. He comes and in a sense, breaks His own justice rules with His mercy. That is a very mysterious, very strange aspect of God. Now, it's not what you want to build your theology around, just saying, oh, there's no rules. God breaks the rules so we can all break the rules. That's not it. But there is something mysterious there that comes to us, especially, I think, in the way that we have images. God says, make no graven images. God says, don't bow down before any images. And yet, here we are, very often, taking a knee before a beautiful tabernacle under a giant crucifix that, on Good Friday, we pull out a big wooden crucifix and people come up and they kiss a wooden crucifix. Not even the crucifix, just a wooden cross. On Good Friday, we go up and we hold and we kiss because we want to honor God through something which is real, that we can feel, that we can sense. That's what art is supposed to do. Art is supposed to inspire in us what is above that comes down and meets us so that we can interact with it. So that it's not just some abstract truth about the nature of God. Three persons, one God, almighty, all-powerful, all-benevolent, omniscient. Instead of just thinking about the theology of God, we're required to love Him here in this world through what is tangible. Often art is meant to prepare us for the same thing in the real world, in the not-so-artsy world, right? That, for example, if we are to, see images of the glory of God, we know that those images don't even come close to the real glory of God, but they prepare us for it. If all we do is live in the woods like a bunch of cavemen, right, and then we would be blasted with the glory of God, it might be too much for us to handle. But if we can spend some time in a sacred place that no other buildings look like our churches, right? No other buildings look like the way that we're all organized here. This is hard. The closest thing to this is some kind of a stage, but this isn't a stage, right? Everybody can tell this is a sanctuary. This is where special things are. You all watched Father Pulse take those sacred vessels and carefully wash them to make sure that what we have right here is treated with all of the respect that we would want to treat a vessel for God. As we get used to that, it's supposed to be inspiring us to see ways in which what is lowly is integrated with what is above, so that when we go out into the world and we encounter our neighbor, and our neighbor looks extra dirty, our neighbor looks extra repulsive, right? Our neighbor looks like our neighbor is going to cost us a little bit, that we might be able to say, it's okay, I've already seen, I know how this is supposed to work. I've seen this and I know how this is supposed to work. There's an image of a saint, St. Martin de Tours, who's riding on his horse, and many of you may have seen it, where he's got his sword and he's cutting his cape in half for a poor beggar. Are y'all familiar with this image? When I was a little kid, we had a holy card, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. There was a saint who could ride a horse. I thought this was great. He had a sword. I thought it made him tough and all this kind of stuff. Well, there he is. He's cutting his cape in half to give half of his cape to a poor man who's below him and raising his hands. And so that shows us that is a saint who does that. I remember the first time I saw that very same image, except the halo that was around St. Martin de Tours' head was also around the poor beggar's head. And that image, to know that St. Martin of Tours was not just giving his cloak to a poor man, but to Jesus. Whatsoever you do for the least of my people, hit different from then on. Whatsoever you do for the least of my people, that you do unto me. That's going to feel different when you've got that image in your mind, just burned into your mind. And now, what was lowly has been brought up just a little bit into that whole realm. That was done specifically through art, through good art. So if any of you are maybe think about being an artist, if any of you think about patronizing the arts, if any of you are thinking about, in some kind of way interacting with art, keep in mind what the purpose of art is for. To take what is low and bring it up above into that whole realm of what is deep and what is true. Jesus did exactly that in his life, right? Jesus, who was despised and rejected, there was a prophecy about that long before the life of Jesus on earth as we know it, right? In Isaiah 53, we read that he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. That's a description of God, right? That's a description of God. He was low, right? He was low. If art is only there to please my senses, then art is not very powerful. But if you can get art to show me that connection, it's done its job. We know that when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the day that everybody had their palm leaves, he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. There's a prophecy that goes back to Zechariah, where it says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." We know that the Messiah would be scorned, and his hands scorned, and his hands and his feet would be bound, and lots would be cast. Right? That comes from the prophecies that are in the Psalms. Long before Jesus walked the earth as we knew it, it says, "He trusts in the Lord," they say. "Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. Centuries and centuries before Jesus, they knew what to look for because of their poetry in the Psalms. They knew what to look for when they saw Jesus. Those who were familiar with the artwork of the Psalms could recognize Jesus when they saw him. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. That goes all the way back to the Psalms. Psalm 41, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." Who could believe that Jesus, as he picks his 12 apostles, he picks one of them named Judas? I mean, if you didn't know about that prophecy, you would think Jesus just was bad at picking friends, you know? But you see it here, it prepares you for it. It makes you ready for what you're going to see in Jesus so that you don't reject Jesus when you do encounter him, right? In Numbers 21, we see, "So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived." God has come to us and been put up on a cross. And for those of us who are facing death, if we look upon that cross and we understand the way in which our life is connected to his, we will live. And we know in the end that in the book of Isaiah, again, centuries and centuries before Jesus walked the earth, we hear from the prophet Isaiah, "On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples. The sheet that covers all nations, he will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken." In Tampa, Florida, I used to teach out at our Jesuit high school in Tampa, Florida. They had this really, really ugly chapel in the middle of the campus there. So the whole campus is surrounding the chapel. Good idea, right? Have your whole campus, make your chapel a prominent thing on campus, right? It was very prominent. But boy, oh boy, was it ugly, right? If you looked up at the ceiling, the inside of it looked just like one of those things you squeeze orange juice with or whatever. Like it was like all jagged. It was terrible looking, right? And so if any of you know Father Hermes, one of the first things he did when he arrived on that campus is he said, "That's got to go. I'm building a new one," right? Almost nobody is building new churches these days. But in Tampa, at the Jesuit high school there, we built a new church. We built a new chapel. I say we. I didn't have anything to do with it. But they built this great big chapel, giant chapel. And again, if you know Father Hermes, you know that he had probably 3 times more than you needed in terms of altar servers and everything on the day they were going to dedicate the chapel. So there's just all these altar servers running everywhere. There were about 14 or 15 different priests that were concelebrating, and you had this bishop who was there for us to consecrate all the altars, and they lit little fires on the altars. There's a beautiful ritual, and I would say most of us may never see a chapel dedicated, but I was glad I got to see it, right? And you have this bishop who gets up there and he's got, at the end of Mass, when Mass is all said and done, almost all said and done, the ritual calls for the bishop to take a ciborium and to be all wrapped up in all kind of robes and stuff, like you've seen where you barely see his eyes, you know, and he's supposed to not even touch it. He's supposed to have his hands, you know, put inside these pockets inside of his robes, and he holds up this ciborium, this vessel for all of the hosts that were not consumed to be put in the tabernacle. And the ritual calls for the bishop to walk all the way around the chapel, to walk all the way around and come back and then put it into the tabernacle. Well, we had been going through the Mass for about an hour and a half at this point. Everybody was tired, but we loved it. It was beautiful. But sure enough, the bishop went to start his big trek, and he trips. He fell flat on his face. And sure enough, that ciborium hit the floor, made a big clanging noise. Consecrated hosts flood the aisle right down the middle. Everybody did exactly what you're all doing. You're all covering your mouths. It was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're doing this, right? And I'll tell you, when I watched it happen, I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe it was a minor miracle, but it was as though God touched my heart and said, this is no worse than the actual crucifixion. So all of the beauty, all of the smoke, all of the altar servers, all of the priests everywhere, all of the glory, 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 glory. And God found a way to make sure that we were finding a way to integrate what was low and what was high. God found a way to make sure that we got reminded that Jesus himself had bruised knees, had a whipped back, right? Had a pierced side, had sweat mixed with blood, had water and blood pouring from his side. There was nothing about that that would have seemed glorious here on earth. And at that moment when the bishop fell, there was nothing glorious about it. And yet somehow it was, I wish that would never happen, right? I'm not saying I'm glad it happened. But when it happened, it was like I believe that everybody in that chapel knew that was a sign that is Jesus, right? That is the Jesus that has come to meet us. So we want to be careful that we don't just substitute religious art with what appears to be beautiful, right? We don't just say, I want everything to look the most beautiful I can. God's going to correct us somehow if we get that wrong, right? We are supposed to be lifting up and bringing together what is above. I think that in the most beautiful piece of art on the entire campus is that crucifix that you see behind the altar. That you look upon an image that is meant to remind us of God himself who has come to be with us, and he's filled a hierarchy from the highest of high, the almightiest of the almighty, the best of the best, all the way down to being born just this little ball of flesh placed in a manger to live his life, a humble life with the Virgin Mary and with St. Joseph, to live his life up to the point where he begins to preach and people scoff. He's performing miracles all around him and people still say he's not the one. They say that he's performing his miracles by the power of demons, right? And finally, when he's gotten to be too much, on the highest feast in the best city in the world, in Jerusalem, right, on the highest feast, they decide, let's kill that guy. Let's get him out of the way, and we better do it quick before our big holy day arrives, because he just is a thorn in our side, right? And they crucify him, and he descends even lower. He goes into the land of the dead to set free Adam and all of those who have died before us in sin. That's what God does. He fills the entire hierarchy from top to bottom. Our art should reflect that. A lot of it should be high. A lot of it should be beautiful. A lot of it should also remind us exactly where we are and exactly where Jesus comes to meet us. That's the job of it. So that when we do meet God, when we do meet Jesus, we see him in all of his glory, and we see him also in that beggar who's asking for half of what we have. Amen. We have cookies in the cafeteria down below, so you are all definitely invited for us to make our way down there. I'll be down there. I'm sure the other Jesuits will be down there, so I'll see y'all down there soon. Thank y'all for coming out tonight.